Chapter 4. The new ship floated in front of the Enterprise, as though it was some small predator just waiting for the larger prey to move before attacking. "Captain," Uhura called out, as she let out a slight breath of relief. "I am receiving a transmission from the new vessel requesting that visual communications be established." Kirk paused in his acknowledgement to Uhura, looking at Commander Phelps' expectant expression. "Mr. Phelps, lock all weapons on that ship and prepare to fire on my order. If this turns out to be more trouble, I want to be prepared." The captain then gestured for Uhura to open communications. The starfield dissolved into a distorted, static-filled image of the captain of the mystery ship. The bearded face looked human, but could barely be recognized as such through the video snow that jilted the image. The voice transmission was similarly garbled, and could not be understood other than the occasional word or segment of one. The bridge crew did their best to define the image and words by straining their collective senses, but to no avail. "Uhura, can you clear that up?" Kirk finally asked, motioning at the cracking image. She nodded at Kirk and headed for the communications console. After some delicate fine-tuning, the video static cleared somewhat to show that the man on the screen was indeed a bearded human male. "I have the audio in fine, sir, but I'm still getting some odd static on the video portion," Uhura told Kirk as her fingers worked over the console. "I'll continue to try and clear the picture." Kirk signaled that he understood before he looked at the bearded face before him. The man appeared in his mid-30s, as far as Kirk could guess, but somehow the dark eyes projected the image that this man was much more experienced than that age would have allowed. The beard was neatly trimmed, not ragged like a Klingon, and did not serve to hide a grim frown. Wavy brown hair flowed to neck length, but was kept out of the eyes by a bright red cloth headband, its two ends barely visible behind his head. His attire was that of a well-dressed mercenary. A bright red sleeveless shirt of some material that looked as fine and smooth as silk, and matching the headband in color, was worn under a vest made of a dark brown fur with black highlights running through it. The face conveyed the emotion of impatience. "Federation ship, can you hear me now?" a grim voice asked. Again, the apparent age of the captain did not match the serious and authoritative tone. "Yes," Kirk replied with a slight nod. "We can hear you, but we are having problems with your video signal. We are attempting to rectify them." "Most likely you suffered some communication damage during your battle. I am Captain J.F. Savage of the independent trade ship Ravager. I notice that I have the honor of saving the U.S.S. Enterprise, although I am somewhat at a loss. Are you not James T. Kirk? I had been told that you had retired along with most of your command crew." Kirk winced slightly at the mention of his retirement. The unpleasant memory was thrown back into the depths of Kirk's mind as he stared at the man before him. So this was Captain Savage. The renegade captain was obviously one for making grand entrances. Kirk responded after the brief pause. "Yes, Captain Savage. Your information is correct. I am James Kirk, and I had retired. However, my crew and myself were reactivated due to current—" "It doesn't matter," Savage cut in suddenly, acting as though he had other places to go and other things to do, and was impatient in having this discussion. The bearded face formed a roguish look. "What matters is that we saved your ship from almost certain destruction at the hands of 2 Klingon warships. What we need to do now is discuss some type of compensation for risking my ship and crew in doing so." "What?" Kirk demanded as he stood up from the command chair and moved closer to the image. "You want us to reward you for this?" "We were—" Savage cut Kirk off quickly, with intolerance. "But of course, Captain, I'm not in the habit of risking my ship and crew for nothing." Kirk turned red, preparing to let loose a volley of what Spock called colorful metaphors, when he called Uhura, quietly signaling in an attempt to gain his attention. "One moment, Captain Savage," Kirk said roughly as he shut off the comm channel. "What is it, Uhura?" "I found the trouble with the transmission, Captain. There's a second video signal coming in that's tied with the main video transmission. The two are on slightly different frequencies, but close enough to interfere with each other if taken as a whole. Yet they are far enough apart that I can separate them. Uhura's face became puzzled. It seems like the two transmissions are designed to do exactly what they're doing, appearing as a static-filled single transmission. The second transmission is text only. Kirk was also puzzled. Why would anyone piggyback two transmissions like that? Then it caught hold. Some sort of coded message? Uhura nodded. I believe so, sir. Unless separated by extreme fine-tuning of the frequencies, the second transmission would not be detectable. Of course, Kirk thought. Regulation 46A. If transmissions are being monitored during battle, no uncoded messages on an open channel. Kirk turned back to the hovering ship on the view screen. Can you put both text and the main video on at the same time? Yes, sir, Uhura informed him. It appears to be designed for just that. Kirk smiled faintly. Re-establish communications with the text. The picture reformed, the face of Savage still looking anxious to get on with business. This time, however, the view was static-free. Along the bottom of the view screen were yellow letters spelling out the word Pteropodes. Kirk understood at last and muted the comm. Uhura, can you send a video signal back with our main signal at the same frequency as the text transmission? A nod answered his question. Good. Then send the word runestone. Kirk switched on the comm again. Sorry for the wait, Captain Savage. We found our communication problem. Savage did not change his expression at all. Well, Kirk, have you decided to pay a reward, or shall I exact my own? The yellow text vanished to be replaced by more yellow text reading. Transmission may be intercepted. Cannot scramble transmission without arousing suspicion. Kirk quickly read the text. He then raised his arm slightly as if surrendering to the problem. And just what do you want from us? He asked, going along with the ruse. It's not as though we are a cargo ship carrying supplies. I understand that, Captain, and we can discuss that later. After all, being saved by the best deserves the highest payment possible. Savage smiled slightly. I'm sure you probably have something in your private stock that could start out our negotiations. McCoy leaned over to whisper in Kirk's ear. Cocky little bastard, isn't he? Quiet, Bones, Kirk whispered back in a serious tone. Bones? Savage questioned. Ah, yes, of course. Dr. Leonard H. McCoy. The captain's lips curled to a slight smile. But of course I'm cocky, Doctor. The best can afford to be. The entire crew was somewhat shocked, McCoy being more so. Only Spock with his Vulcan hearing should have heard what the two had whispered. The bridge microphone was not designed to pick up low-volume sounds, and the comments should have been well below their auditory level and not have been transmitted. McCoy glared quickly at Savage. Just how the hell do you know who I am? He demanded. Savage smiled craftily. A great many people and names are known to me, Doctor, and you would be surprised at what one can learn from the background chatter of a bridge. The man leaned closer to the video pickup, his smile fading. Now, Captain Kirk, we need to get your ship out of the triangle before more of our friends drop in. Can you move out on your own, or do you need to be towed? Kirk grimaced slightly. Either Savage was one of the best actors off the entertainment circuit, or he was taking his role for real. Yes, Captain Savage, we can get out on our own power. A tow is not necessary. However, we can only travel on impulse power. Savage smirked as he leaned back in his chair. Fine with me. It'll give me time to consider what the proper service charge will be. He stopped smiling suddenly and leaned over to his right as a barely perceptible beep sounded. Kirk glanced back at Spock for a moment, then back at the screen. Savage was looking down at something over the shoulder of another person. Kirk could see the top of the crew member's head. The two blue antennae and the snow-white hair made the species instantly recognizable as an Andorian. Kirk, Savage said in a deadly serious tone, we have another visitor. A cloaked Romulan ship is coming this way. ETA in 6.2 minutes. Don't do anything, cadet. I'll handle this. The transmission was cut off before Kirk could even say a word. The Ravager made a tight reverse arc and faded away into the depths of space. Kirk took the opportunity to move over at Spock's station with an expectant look. I detect no such ship. The only ships on our scanners that we can locate are the two derelicts. Spock looked up. But if the Ravager's sensors are as specialized as its communications, they may be able to detect what we cannot. And the cloaking device? Kirk asked, glancing back at the starfield. Spock tilted his head slightly. I have no knowledge of any such Federation or Ally ship being so equipped. Same here, Kirk admitted. Despite the cloaking devices that Starfleet had captured, both Romulan and Klingon, none had ever been made to function correctly. Once hooked up to the computer and power systems, the devices sometimes worked once or twice before shorting out, or they would explode from an overload. Even the cloaking device of the bird of prey that he had commandeered from Crooge failed to work after they crash-landed in San Francisco Bay. The worst situation occurred when Starfleet built their own cloaking device prototype. It was mounted on U.S.S. August and was going to be tested. Several top brass and scientists were aboard for the initial testing. It was hailed as an important history-breaking event, which it was, just not as it was intended. The cloaking device worked, and the August disappeared. But the ship never reappeared. The U.S.S. August and her entire complement had not been seen or heard from since. The scientists at Starfleet determined that the cloaking device somehow had its circuits fused to the point that it could not be turned off. In private circles, they honestly simply did not know what happened. The August could not be contacted or scanned. The ship had just apparently winked out of existence, never to return. Captain Kirk, Phelps called. Forward deflectors are back up to full power. Good. Raise shields but power down weapons. McCoy's mouth dropped slightly. Are you sure that's wise, Jim? Probably not, the captain frowned. But I trust my instincts about Savage. I don't think he'll let us down. McCoy grumbled something quietly as he turned away, making Kirk turn towards him. What was that, Bones? I said he probably won't. After all, how could he collect from us if he did? Kirk chuckled slightly as he sat back in the command chair heavily. He does strike you as the type, doesn't he? At least you can say that he has a healthy ego. Yeah, McCoy agreed with a wry smile. He does kind of remind me of somebody. Kirk ignored McCoy's comment. Uhura, any word yet from sickbay or damage control? Yes, sir. Dr. Danis is on the line now. Now for the bad news, Kirk thought. Doctor, this is Kirk. What type of injuries do we have? Captain Kirk, she responded, obviously upset. All of the bridge crew are dead, except for Communications Officer Foley. Captain Henley was impaled by a support beam. She paused. He, died instantly, sir. He never knew what happened. The others died from burns due to radiation and electrical overloads. Fortunately for Lieutenant Foley, her system was able to handle higher levels of radiation than humans. She is on a critical list, but she should recover. Kirk frowned. Henley certainly deserved better than to die like that. Still, had he listened to reason. What about the rest of the crew? Kirk asked. We lost 12 more crewmen from decks 2 and 3 with an additional 16 in critical condition from radiation poisoning. She paused to catch her breath. We have initiated radiation treatment for all crew that were on decks 2 and 3, and are screening those from deck 4. McCoy leaned over slightly to the comm pickup. Can you use some help down there, Shirley? I don't think so, Lynn. We have everything under control for now. Thank you, Doctor, Kirk said grimly as he switched the channel over to damage control. Damage control, report. Maxwell here, sir. The voice came over. All damage control personnel are still working. Very well, Kirk replied. Maxwell's tone did not carry the smugness it had earlier. Report. The turbolift shafts to the bridge have been cleared and are functional. You now have access to the main bridge, but still a mess up there, sir. It will be several hours before we get all the damaged circuits replaced or repaired. Captain Scott is up there now overseeing damage control. Aft deflector generator will be operable in a few minutes, and warp drive will be up in 20. Good work, Commander Maxwell. I compliment you and your teams, Kirk responded with some courtesy. There was silence for the moment. Thank you, sir, he replied in a somewhat humble and surprised tone. Kirk switched over to another communications channel. Kirk to Scott. The automatic communications transfer took a second before switching on. Aye, sir, came the distinct voice, tired and at a distance from the audio pickup. I just heard Maxwell report, Scotty. What's it like up there? Kirk asked, seeing Scott in his mind's eye, arm deep inside some burned-out console. Ach, it's a bloody mess, sir, in more ways than one. The voice became louder and clearer as Scott neared his end of the comm unit. Almost all the circuits are shorted and fused. It'll be the better part of a day before I can get you up here to run the show. Very well, Mr. Scott. Do the best you can. Spot looked at his scanner readout. 1 minute, 3 seconds before ETA of the Romulan ship that Captain Savage mentioned. All of our scans still report no such presence. We'll just sit here and wait it out, Spock, Kirk responded grimly. The news about the bridge crew had not been totally unexpected, but still it bothered him. Thoughts of the other dead crewmen, with the possibility of more to die from radiation, made him ill. It was at times such as these that Kirk wished he had never become a starship captain. Yet, as McCoy would have reminded him, how many lives did he save by being where and who he was? 2 minutes had now passed beyond what Savage had given as the ETA for the Romulan ship, and Kirk was beginning to wonder if the arrogant captain had been wrong. Then, space distorted. The Romulan ship appeared out of nothingness, seemingly created out of the darkness of space as it decloaked off the port bow. Its brilliantly painted hull design made the ship's class identification error-free. That's a T-10 destroyer, Phelps exclaimed as he recognized the ship before them, also known as the Bright One. Affirmative, Spock agreed with a slight nod. The striking paint design does make the class easily identifiable. Sir, Uhura called from the communications console. The Romulan commander is hailing us. Kirk motioned for Uhura to wait a moment. Weapon status on the destroyer? Negative power readings, Phelps replied, with a perplexed tone. Shields have not been activated either. Kirk furrowed his brow in apprehension, but signaled for the communication to be put through. On screen, Uhura. The face of the Romulan commander filled the screen, wearing a look of skepticism. His uniform was flat black, broken only by the cobalt blue sash going from his left shoulder to somewhere by his unseen right hip. Kirk studied the commander's features of straight black hair and upswept pointed ears. They were the same as Vulcans, a fact that always made Kirk wonder if any Romulan spies were passing for Vulcans and gathering information about Starfleet. Romulan Commander, Kirk started formally. This is Captain James Kirk of the starship U.S.S. Enterprise, the Romulan continued. Although I understood that you were no longer in Starfleet. The commander frowned slightly at the mystery, but then raised an eyebrow. I was wondering what Federation captain had the skill and nerve to destroy 3 Klingon warships and apparently sustain little damage to his own ship. That last bit trailed off as a taunting query, but Kirk did not show any facial expression. Instead, one thought flew through Kirk's mind. Does everyone in the triangle know who I am? The Federation captain dismissed the thought, looking at the stern face before him. Kirk returned the grim smile of the Romulan as he asked in mock agitation, What is it you want, Commander? The Romulan seemed to ignore the question. And here I thought that you had been deemed too old for active service. I see now that my information was incorrect. He nodded slightly as an honorable gesture. At any rate, Captain Kirk, I happen to have picked up the end of your battle on long-range sensors, and thought I would offer my services. Kirk showed modest surprise. Services, Commander? Yes. but I see now that you do not need any assistance with the Klingons. However, since I have never heard of a Federation starship acting as a garbage scow, I will be more than willing to take charge of the derelicts if you wish." Then he smiled. "Along with anything else you might like to give up?" Kirk winced at the thought, but was cut off the comm channel by another transmission before he could return with a comment of his own. "How about a torpedo up the aft?" Kirk smiled slightly at the pun, and was surprised to see the commander doing the same as the Ravager shimmered into existence behind the destroyer with its weapons and shields powered up. "Savage!" the commander exclaimed with a smile as he turned to face a smaller view screen that was off to the side. "I presume that you want to lay claim to all 3 ships?" 3 ships? As far as Kirk could tell, there were only 2 ships that could be salvaged. "No, Satarlis," Savage answered. "The Enterprise is under my wing. That is, until they pay a substantial reward to my crew for saving them. As for the Klingon Kavos, it's all yours. I have no time for it today." He smiled. "Of course, you will owe me the pick of the lot next time." Satarlis smiled with a nod and turned back to face Kirk. 2 ships are better than none, at least for today. He gave Kirk a slight nod. "I hope to meet you again, Captain Kirk." Then the image was gone. McCoy looked around the bridge, lost for a moment with the events that had just occurred. On the view screen, the Romulan destroyer slowly turned away, heading for the drifting Klingon ships. He turned back to Kirk with a questioning look. "That's it? I don't get it. They're just going to leave us alone?" Kirk shrugged slightly. "It appears so, Bones." McCoy flustered a moment, doing his best to put perspective on everything. "What was it that Savage called the Klingon ships? Kilvan Kavus?" "Klavas Kavos, Dr. McCoy," Spock corrected. "It translates roughly to Klingon garbage." He looked at Kirk. "An interesting conversation between the two." Kirk nodded. "Seems that Captain Savage is full of surprises, Mr. Spock. Hopefully he'll turn out to be a fountain of knowledge about what's going on." He turned to Uhura, still stationed at the communications console. "Commander, contact the Ravager, even though I could probably just talk out loud and have him hear me." Uhura smiled slightly. "Captain Savage, online, sir." "Captain Kirk," Savage replied with a smile that was equal to the warmth of deep space. "You are clear to proceed into Federation space. I suggest that you travel at best speed before we meet any more ships. There is a sizable bounty on you and your ship from the Klingons, and I'm sure you don't want to add to your already high bill." "Understood, Captain Savage." Kirk out. The comm was shut off. "Commander Phelps, head for Federation space at full impulse." "Full impulse. Aye, sir. Federation space in 8 minutes." Kirk sat back in the chair to ease his back. He eyed McCoy for a moment. "What's your opinion of our savior, Bones?" McCoy was motionless for a moment, then realized that Kirk had spoken to him. "I don't know, Jim. I mean, anyone that refers to 2 Klingon ships they blasted out of space as garbage, well, he can't be all bad." Kirk just harumphed at the comment. The Federation ship moved toward open space, closely followed by the independent trade ship Ravager. The Romulan destroyer continued its search and salvage operations on the derelict Klingon vessels, ignoring the other ships. Once safely within the borders of Federation space, Kirk invited Captain Savage and his officers to beam over in an hour to discuss the situation at Ganeth. Commander Phelps had already called for the next bridge shift to begin early to relieve Kirk and his crew so they could meet with Savage. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell had declined the offer to take part in the meeting, saying that he was still supervising the repairs, but he would leave his intercom open. Likewise, Dr. Danis could not attend due to an emergency surgery on one of the injured crew. After a brief break to refresh themselves, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy stood in silence as the turbo lift carried them to the transporter room. "Just how much do you know about Savage?" McCoy asked Kirk, breaking the stillness. "Not much, Bones," Kirk replied. "I've only heard stories about how he didn't like the rigid authority of Starfleet Command, preferring to do things his way. Interesting, Spock commented. Such individuals seldom reach captain's rank, if any rank at all. Kirk shrugged. Usually that would be true, but as several have said, he does possess a good tactical mind, he continued. And he is also known for the more important skill of being able to get things done when no one else can. As such, he has never been reprimanded to the full extent of the rules. Jim Kirk's hazel eyes twinkled as he looked at McCoy and smiled slightly, giving the innocent boy look, as Bones called it. It does sort of remind you of somebody, doesn't it? Spock raised an eyebrow, but otherwise tried to ignore the pun. I'm still mystified by the behavior of Savage and the Romulan commander. I have never before known of such a dialogue to occur. The turbo lift stopped, and the three stepped out into the corridor. Yes, it was interesting, Kirk responded, continuing the conversation, and the way that they maneuvered their ship through the asteroids on full impulse. Savage must have an exceptionally good helmsman. The weapons officer wasn't too bad either, McCoy interjected. I wonder just how skilled his crew is compared to standard Academy issue. Indeed, Spock added as he walked into the transporter room, receiving a nod from the transporter officer. I wonder if their medical officer is as equally skilled as the others appear to be. Kirk rushed up to the transporter console as McCoy turned to face Spock. Now don't start giving me the potions and rattles routine, Spock. If you had some blood other than that green soup of yours... The transporter technician cut in. Sir, Captain Savage is signaling that he is ready to transport. Energize, Kirk said as McCoy grumbled the last of his remarks about Spock. He didn't need to hear any more. He had done so already several times, and for several years. He did glance at the technician briefly, making a mental note to recommend to Phelps that the ensign receive a promotion for being so apt in timing her interruption to McCoy. 3 of the transporter pads began to glow as flowing energy columns reshaped themselves into humanoid figures. The forms finally solidified into 1 human and 2 aliens, each one armed with pistols. Captain J.F. Savage stood like a statue as he gazed about the room, acting as though he was searching for some hidden enemy. His eyes shifted from the corners of the transporter chamber to the technician, a slight smile formed upon seeing her. Then his eyes locked onto the 3 Enterprise officers. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy simultaneously studied the man before them. Captain Savage was dressed in a long-sleeved white shirt with ruffles at the cuff and an open collar. A flowing red silk sash tied at the hip, satin black pants, and almost knee-high black boots helped complete the picture in Kirk's mind of a flamboyant pirate from old Earth's oceans. The floor-length black cape that Savage wore was attached to the shoulder by a silver chain, and it fluttered slightly as he moved down the steps of the pad. Kirk's gaze also caught what was attached to the red sash at Savage's hip. On the right side was a holster pistol of some unknown origin and design. It wasn't a phaser of any design that Kirk had seen. From what he could see of the sidearm, it was larger and bulkier than the sleeker phaser or disruptor pistols used by the more advanced space races. Sulu could probably identify it, Kirk thought, remembering how Sulu used to collect pistols. On the left side was a sheathed dagger. The light caught the many jewels that were set into the pommel, obviously of some significance. Kirk offered his hand as he looked Savage in the eyes. He noticed that the red headband was gone, leaving the flowing brown hair to hang freely. Captain Savage, welcome aboard. Savage gripped the hand strongly. My honor, Captain Kirk. These are my command officers. He spoke with pride as he motioned to the 2 behind him. Kirk followed this motion. The closest of the 2 was the Andorian that Kirk had briefly spotted on the bridge of the Ravager. The officer was dressed in the blue battle dress of his people. Light blue pants and a long-sleeved shirt formed the basis of the uniform, both being slightly more bulky than they would have been, indicating that they were some type of light armor. The darker blue vest looked very stiff and rigid, looking like plated armor made from plasteel material. On the Andorian's waist was a dark blue sash, similar in appearance and function to the one Savage wore. The holster pistol was there, along with a sheathed knife, although it was not as jewel-encrusted as Savage's. The other alien was a tall, slender woman, similar to a Cation in female appearance, but was definitely either an offshoot or another race that evolved similarly. Unlike Cations, this feline lady did not have the long external tail, nor was she as stocky. For comparison, one could imagine the Cations being similar to Earth's lions in basic muscular build. The closest comparison that Kirk could imagine for the body structure of this alien before him would have been that of an extinct cheetah. This species was designed more for stealth and agility rather than brute strength. She was tall and thin, with a very human-like face, lined in a fine, light tan fur. As the fur reached where the hairline would be on a human, it became longer and darker. Her hair, or perhaps mane, was a dark golden brown in color, reaching about shoulder length, and finer than that of human hair. It was then that he noticed that her waist, tied by a black sash, was now the familiar dagger. Opposite was a holster pistol, longer than the others, but probably no less deadly. The knee-length black boots that finished her outfit were shined to perfection. Kirk was unsure as to why, but he surmised that the boots somehow contained more than just the slender legs of the person wearing them. Savage smiled slightly as he noticed both Kirk and McCoy stare at the woman behind him. Such reactions were not uncommon in the various trading posts that they traveled, and she reveled in the fact. The feline proved to be a useful distraction during bargaining, but her figure had started more bar fights than Romulan ale. Savage interrupted the lingering looks of the two Starfleet officers. "Gentlemen," he motioned to the Andorian, "this is my first officer, weapons officer, and science officer, Shaki." The Andorian bowed as he stepped down from the transport pad. The introduction caught McCoy and Kirk somewhat out of the blue. They had somewhat forgotten that he was there, with their focus being on the female officer that stood on the platform. "And this pretty lady is Shahon," Savage said in a broad smile. "My second officer, and she is also my helm and navigation." Shahon slightly stepped down the steps, showing the agility and grace of her feline race. "Captain Kirk," she greeted with a voice that sounded like a quiet wind blowing through the trees. Kirk grasped her hand in greeting and winced slightly at the strength of her grip. Savage smiled at Kirk's reaction. "Oh, don't be fooled by her good manners, Captain. She's the nicest lady you would ever want to meet as long as you remain on her good side. Do otherwise and the fur really flies." Shahon cast a look back at Savage and gave a slight growl, showing one of her canines in mock disgust. Kirk merely nodded in understanding as he released her hand. He had also felt the very sharp tips of her retractable claws, and decided that he would rather not find out just how skilled she was in using them. Kirk wished that he could have rubbed his hands for a few moments to get the circulation back from the tight grip. Instead, he introduced his officers. "This is my acting first officer and science officer, Captain Spock." Savage nodded and greeted Spock in Vulcan, causing a raised eyebrow, but a similar greeting. "You speak Vulcan very fluently, Captain." Again, Savage nodded slightly. "I am honored, Captain Spock. However, I only know some of the more common phrases and greetings in Vulcan. I am, however, fluent in Romulesta and Klingonese." "Indeed," Spock nodded, which for him was an acknowledging smile. Kirk motioned to McCoy. "This is Dr. McCoy, who I believe you already know." "Yes, indeed," Savage said, smiling. "My pleasure, Dr. McCoy." He turned to Kirk, and his smile faded into a grim frown. "What happened to Captain Henley? Was he not supposed to be in command?" Kirk returned the frown. "He was, until the Klingons made a suicide run. He was killed along with most of the bridge crew." Savage shook his head once. "I see. And the Enterprise is still badly beat up. Do you require any assistance for repair?" At least that was a genuine, sincere offer, Kirk thought, as he answered. "I don't think so. I have 2 chief engineers aboard that can fix her back up, if they don't kill each other first. Thanks for the offer, though." Savage bowed slightly. "As you wish. We have much to discuss, and we are short on time. It's best we get started with our briefing as soon as possible. Kirk nodded and motioned towards the door. This way then, Captain. The group strode down the corridor, Savage and his crew receiving various looks of puzzlement and curiosity from the Enterprise crew that they passed. As the group loaded on the turbolift, Spock continued his wondering stare at the holstered weapons that Savage and his two officers wore. Being from a peaceful race, Spock was often appalled by the way humans reveled in it, and especially displaying weapons when they did not need to. Although not as familiar with weapons as some others may have been, he did recognize most of the common hand weapons used within or close to Federation space. He had yet to identify the pistols that these three wore. "Excuse me, Captain Savage," Spock inquired as the doors slid shut and the lift began to travel. "I'm curious as to the type of sidearm that you are wearing." Savage smiled somewhat, surprised that a peaceful Vulcan would be interested in a hand weapon. He unholstered a pistol and offered it to Spock. "It's not surprising that you can't identify my weapon, Captain Spock. It's not very common." Spock accepted the pistol and was surprised at its weight. After all, he was used to the very much lighter weight Starfleet phasers. Spock turned it over carefully as he examined the dark gray weapon. It does not appear to be either a laser or phaser, nor does it seem to be a disruptor-type weapon. Perhaps some type of plasma ejector or particle beam? Kirk leaned over slightly, trying to look as though he was less interested than he actually was. "Very perceptive, Captain Spock. It is not a phaser or a disruptor," Savage responded. "It is a Tylerian blaster, Mark IV, to be exact. True that it's not as efficient in power utilization as a disruptor, or as neat and tidy as a phaser, but there are times when neatness and energy efficiency are not desired qualities for a hand weapon." "That is an illogical statement," Spock commented as he handed the weapon back. "Using minimal energy at maximum damage is always desirable for an energy weapon." "That's normally true, Captain, but we sometimes deal with beings that are not at all that logical," Savage said in a knowing tone as he holstered the pistol. He smiled slightly as he continued. "A big bang and a large chunk of matter being destroyed can be very effective when you know how to apply it." "Have you ever read the story about the gun without a bang?" Shaki asked the Vulcan. Spock shook his head. "I can understand, as it is an ancient story of the genre called science fiction of the time. Its author, Robert Sheckley, wrote of a tale in which a man had a powerful pistol that instantly disintegrated his target, but in complete silence. He soon found himself hunted by a pack of aggressive creatures, and although he killed many with the weapon, because of its silence and lack of remains from the dead creatures, the pack was not afraid of him." Spock nodded in understanding. "So, you prefer this weapon for its psychological effect on opponents?" "Correct," Savage responded. "If, for example, a group of opponents are seeking cover behind some large rocks, a phaser may be able to simply disintegrate a part of the rock with one shot, but it doesn't scare anyone except for the one that was behind that particular piece of rock. A disruptor must be set on very high power to do anything to the rock, and again, there is little psychological effect." Savage patted the holster pistol. "Not only will this weapon blast away the rock and the person behind it, but it does so loudly and very showy. Plus, when put on full automatic, it can level a building or a crowd of opponents equally well. It's not a nice weapon, but it does get the job done. And at times, just a show of a big pistol, or even a shot at the ceiling, will often negate the use of force upon the actual beings themselves," Shawan added softly, indicating that she was not quite pleased with the use of deadly force as the other two. The lift slowed to a stop as the doors opened and the group walked out. McCoy continued the conversation. "That explains the pistols, but what about the daggers? I noticed that they are very highly decorated." Savage nodded. "That requires a bit more lengthy and in-depth explanation, which I'm not prepared to delve into this time." McCoy raised an eyebrow in disappointment. But since they had just reached the briefing room, perhaps it was just as well. Scott, Uhura, and Phelps stood up as the group entered the room. Savage stepped towards Phelps with his hand extended. "Line Phelps," he began as he grasped his hand, "I see that you survived the ordeal that I last saw you in." Phelps smiled and nodded. Yes, of course." Inwardly, Phelps was frowning. He had no idea about what Savage was talking about. He couldn't remember for the life of him ever being formally introduced to Savage before, much less in any situation that was dangerous that he would have been present in. "This is Captain Scott, my chief engineer, and Commander Uhura, my communications officer." Then Kirk forgot that Scott wasn't chief engineer on this ship and that Maxwell was, and he was listening on the comm. Well, the hell with him, Kirk thought. Kirk then introduced the newcomers. "This is Captain J.F. Savage of the Ravager and his officers Shaki and Shahon." He then wondered if he should have asked for the officer's rank, but remembered that the Ravager wasn't a Federation ship, and they may not have a rank equivalent. Each officer greeted the others briefly as they sat down. Savage handed Spock a computer disk, which the Vulcan probably entered into the computer terminal. A star map similar to the one Kirk and Henley had shown before appeared on the view screen. This one, however, was much more detailed. "This is Ganeth 2, Savage said as he stood in front of the group and pointed to the view screen and a flashing yellow dot. "Almost 8 days ago, a Romulan bird of prey scout ship, the Aelia, under the command of a Romulan officer by the name of Sator, visited the planet. The commander and some of his crew met with Barros Kenton, the leader of the Northwest region and governor of the capital city, Whitelass. Commander Sator remained for over an hour, then left and sent a transmission to their starbase for that sector. For the next 2 days, Sator was beaming down and talking to Kenton until he finally left 6 days ago." Savage traced a trail from Ganeth to a point inside the Romulan side of the triangle. The Aelia was tracked to where she went back into Romulan space and joined a small fleet of warships, which he pointed to. And that has gotten larger since then. Exactly what the Romulans want on Ganeth is unknown, but whatever it is, they apparently want it bad enough to take it by force. Savage concluded by looking for questions. "Is it possible that this is all meant as an excuse to start a war with the Federation?" Kirk asked, "in light of them building up this fleet of theirs?" "Doubtful, Captain Kirk," Shaki answered. "The Romulans did not know anything about the Federation involvement until today with your meeting with Commander Satarlis. Once he sends his report, the Romulan command will assume that you are here for the Federation and are looking into the situation." "As far as the fleet goes," Savage continued, "it consists of, from what we can tell, 2 M4 troop transports with 1,800 troops each, and what appears to be a Nova-class battleship, plus 5 to 6 vessels ranging from Class 5 Scout to a Class 12 cruiser." Shaki picked up from there. "The standard assembly for taking control of a light to moderately defended star system consists of 2 troop carriers and 2 or 3 support ships. The extra vessels are not there for a fight with the Federation, but rather to keep the Klingons from interfering." He paused. "Which means that whatever it is they want, they're willing to fight for it. But there is no indication as to what they want." Shahon turned to Spock. "Negative. We have heard rumors that there is some type of illness, or perhaps a battle with unknown forces within the Romulan Empire, and that has resulted in the deaths of several hundred in their star service." McCoy perked up a little. "An illness?" "We're not sure," Savage said as he sat down. "Our sources of information have said nothing specific about the deaths, except that they have occurred throughout their fleet." "Excuse me, Captain Savage," Phelps cut in. "Going back slightly, I thought the Romulans were allies of the Klingons, or at least uneasy allies in this part of space." Shaki shook his head in response. "Not really, Commander. What they have is an agreement to exchange materials and technology, at least that which is considered not overly important. The alliance is mostly on paper, and was originally designed with the idea of keeping a thorn in the side of the Federation. In the triangle, the alliance falls apart very quickly. One side would just as soon destroy the other if they can get away with it. You see, Savage continued, the Klingons consider the Romulans to be a little less than trash. They don't understand their culture, and don't want to. All they see is another empire vying for the same resources they want. On the other hand, the Romulans see the Klingons as barbaric savages that waste resources more than use them. They see the Klingons as a culture that destroys for the pleasure of doing so, and with no true sense of honor. "Ye seem to admire the Romulans," Scott questioned. "They're the reason we're out here," Savage responded. "And yes, I do admire much of their culture. Truly, it is not much different from the logical and ordered world of the Vulcan culture, but in their case, they acknowledge that they have emotions, and do not attempt to suppress them." Spock quickly thought about his talk with the female Romulan commander that he and James Kirk had met so long ago on the IC mission that they had been given. Her description of her people sounded much the same way, causing Spock to see Savage as perhaps not so much of an illogical human after all. "So, that was the reason for your resignation?" Spock asked. "A cover for your operations here?" Savage nodded. "Yes, Starfleet wanted some more detailed information about the Romulan culture and their interests here in the Triangle, but were unsure as to how to get it. They had used spies and paid informers, but were still getting only basic information. Project Grey Ghost had improved the information we had about the Romulan Navy, some of their tactics and weapons, but very little about the actual culture. The Iridon papers also provided some clues, but as you all know, it too was limited. "The Iridon papers? What are they?" McCoy asked. The other officers looked at McCoy as though he had asked for an explanation of the most simplest thing possible. All the others, that is, except for Spock. "Due to your medical training, Doctor, it's not surprising that you did not learn about them," Spock began in his dictionary voice. "The Iridon Papers is a report based upon a collection of data discovered on an abandoned Romulan research station. The data contained various forms of writings, from family diaries to children's books and works of fiction, which was, and is, considered to be a great find," Savage added. "However, it did not provide for the details that Starfleet wanted. It would be akin to going to someone's house and gathering all the diaries, books, and other such media, and then using that to determine what the Federation was like." "And so they picked you to fill in the gaps?" McCoy asked, feeling somewhat on the defensive. "Well, not right off the start," Savage explained. "On one of the missions I had as captain of the Wolf, I met an Orion trade family that had ties with Romulans. I contacted Starfleet about their activities, most of which were illegal. That was when IC decided that this may be the back door to get the information that they wanted. Since I had already made contact and was in the area, they asked me if I would be interested in the mission. I replied yes, as long as I could run things my way." "Obviously, they agreed," Phelps said. Savage smiled slightly. "Well, I think it was more in the line of thought that they couldn't find anyone else at the time that would have said yes." He smiled a little. "So, I decided that the best way to get the information needed was to begin a trading relationship with the Romulans as the Orions were doing. There was, however, a slight snag in the plan." Seeing that no one wanted to venture a guess, Savage continued. "If I just up and quit Starfleet to go trading with the Romulans, they would probably know something was up, and probably kill me and the crew. That was when I decided that the best cover I could create was to take a course of action that would show that I was a shady character and wanted more than just standard Starfleet retirement benefits." Kirk and McCoy groaned quietly at the mention of those benefits. "I communicated back to IC and let them know what I was planning. Then I contacted the Orions again and volunteered to carry some cargo for them secretly. I was later turned in by one of my crew, taken through the appropriate legal proceedings, and resigned to start my own trade business. The Orions gave me a ship to start with, but I later earned enough credits to buy it from them, again by some illegal trading, to confirm that I was not a Federation operative, but really was a shady character. IC then outfitted it with everything they had, and we, he motioned to his crew, then outfitted it with what they didn't. That was nearly 4 years ago. And you've been getting inside information ever since, Kirk said with a nod. Oh, much more than that, Captain. We had to prove ourselves to be who we wanted to be, traders dealing specifically with the Romulan Empire. So we carried the usual type of cargo back and forth to convince the Romulans that we really were honest traders. Then he smirked as he continued. That was the same time that the Klingons began to lose ships to a certain mercenary cargo trade captain. Anything that was salvageable from the wreckage, the Romulans were interested in, especially any cloaking devices. Savage smiled and looked at Kirk. I have almost as high as a bounty on my head by the Klingons as you do. I would nay think IC would approve of such. Savage looked at Scott for a moment. Well, there's no love lost in IC for Klingons, especially since Operation Dixie. But then again, I always made sure that the Klingons fired first, and I fired last. I in no way provoked them, for such is not necessary with Triangle Klingons. The Romulans were, well, for a lack of a better word, overjoyed to have someone cleaning the spaceways of Klingons. So much so that they began to supply us with the technical data that they had on the Klingon ships. Shaki laughed slightly, which was much more detailed than anything Starfleet had. We have been given so much that the Triangle IC for the Klingon sector was getting overshadowed by our information. They even threatened to alert the Romulans if we didn't stop, he said with a snicker. Obviously it was an inside joke, Kirk thought. And the Romulans have no idea that you are an IC operative? Oh, I imagine they do, Savage said. They are not a dull-witted race, but we trade fairly and destroy a few Klingons here and there. So I think that they consider any loss of information of the type that we gather to be rather inexpensive for our services. After all, it's not like we are actively trying to get military-based information about them, simply social data. Plus the fact that we have developed some close ties with some of them, Shaki added as he looked at Savage with a slight smile. Some more than others. Shahon also smiled at that one, and Savage gave both of them an icy stare that rapidly dissolved their smiles. Satarless for one, I assume? Yes, Doctor, Savage responded. In fact, we know all of the Romulan ships in the Triangle on site, as well as their command officers, all 78 of them. 46 of those officers hold the rank of sub-commander, and 32 are commanders, mostly high-ranking. That sheer fact of being able to remember that type of information brought some quiet sounds of impression from the Enterprise officers. Savage continued. All of them know me on a first-name basis, including Satarless. 10 commanders and 22 sub-commanders would consider me an ally of the best kind. 4 of the commanders, Sator, Darius, Taloka, and Marlia, the other 2 choked a snicker, causing another icy stare from Savage. And some commanders Tak and Lancius considered me Ravsham Evi. Kirk was sure that meant something significant, but didn't know what. Spock raised his eyebrow. A great honor. I have never heard of any human being considered such before. That's because there are no others, Captain Spock. Spock saw the confused look from his shipmates. The term roughly translates to human brother. There is more depth to the meaning than what it sounds. It is basically the same as blood brother, soulmate, verna calife. Savage could tell that the others still did not fully comprehend the term. What it boils down to is that the officer and his or her family consider me to be a brother or a member of their clan. Think about as an adopted brother is basically it. That's the meaning of the daggers, Doctor. Each jewel represents one of the family clans that I or my officers have been accepted by. But how did you get so close to the Romulans? Phelps asked. Savage turned to answer. Actually, it was very similar to how we came upon you. Commander Sater was under attack by 2 Klingon ships. His deflectors had failed and his ship was taking a heavy pounding. We charged in and rescued his ship. As a reward, we were given a cloaking device and instructions on how to operate it correctly. He was our foot in the door, so to speak. His face suddenly turned grim. Although we paid a high price of our own that day, I sometimes wonder if it was actually worth the loss. Kirk cast a slight glance at Spock, understanding the meaning of such a loss. He turned his attention back to Savage. They gave you a cloaking device for saving his ship? That sounds a little surprising since they considered a cloaking technology so important. It was a debt of honor, Captain, Sean responded to Kirk's curiosity. We have always managed to make sure that the Romulans owe us just a little more than what they pay. We do the same for any Federation ship that we have to save or make runs for. She smiled, and her white canine showed slightly. To maintain our image, though, we usually charge Federation ships a good deal more for our services. Speaking of which, Captain Kirk, Savage said with a sly smile, we would appreciate it if you could transfer a few photon torpedoes over to the Ravager. We just about used up what we had in saving your ship. Seems like a fair price to me, Kirk answered with a nod. Now he knew what Savage had meant earlier. About the problem with the Romulans, do you think any of your contacts could get you some more specific information? Savage shook his head, doubtful. Their sense of duty to the Empire outweighs any loyalty to the family, at least for most of them. But if the deaths were caused by some disease, we may be able to help them find a cure, McCoy stated. Most likely they would refuse such an offer, Doctor. Why? McCoy asked. Quite simply, they would think of it as some kind of trick. They don't trust others easily, especially those that offer something for nothing. Any offer of free help would be regarded as an insult, and yet to pay the Federation for help would be a disgrace. Shaki cut in. They, like my people, are a proud warrior race who depends only upon themselves. To rely on others would be a sign of weakness. Yet you trade with them, McCoy said, somewhat more bitter than he intended. Savage nodded. Many people trade with them. Trading is not considered a weakness, merely as a way to get materials that they either have little of or have none at all, and they don't get the materials free. Then in your opinion, Captain Savage, Uhura asked, there could be no peace between the Federation and the Romulan Empire? Savage frowned a moment, then shook his head slightly as he responded. A truce, perhaps, not to interfere with one another, but to ally themselves with the Federation? No, I really can't see that. It would take some huge catastrophe or threat, one so large that the only logical way to survive would be to form an alliance. Then, perhaps. For now, though, they would only join the Federation if they could control it. Some are interested in the thought of re-establishing contact with the Vulcans, but not nearly enough. And those that express such desires, if they're caught, are usually killed. Spock gave no indication that such information was surprising. It was a well-guarded secret among some of the Vulcans that there was a Romulan underground movement that sought out reunification of the two races. In fact, he was one of the few Vulcans who was attempting to help that movement along. Shaki continued, You see, the Romulan culture is such that they believe it is their destiny to rule the stars. I'm sure that they would join the Federation, as Captain Savage suggested, but somehow I can't envision Starfleet handing control over to the Vulcans. Another factor that would keep the Federation and Romulans apart is the difference between their culture. Shahon looked at Spock. The Vulcans are, excuse the sound of this, Captain Spock, only tolerated by some of the Federation members because they are an intelligent, logical, and peaceful race. Now imagine how these member worlds would feel if suddenly the Vulcans became emotional and warlike. That's what the Romulans are like. No, I don't believe that they could become the Federation's new ally. There's a well-known saying among the Romulans that best describes their attitude to all this, Savage said. It's better to decide between our enemies than our friends, for one of our friends will most likely become our enemy, but on the other hand, one of our enemies will become our friends. The Klingons, however, Shaki added, are barbaric, but more easily understood by humans. If the years of hatred from both sides could be overcome, they could very well become Federation allies. Already, such has been started by you very people. Kirk was beginning to find Savage and his crew somewhat in a more favorable light than he first had, but it was time to get back on track. What about our mission? Savage nodded. Quite right, Captain. Our first mission will be to go to Ganeth and talk to Barris Kenton and find out what it is that the Romulans want. After that, it will depend upon the circumstances that follow. We may be able to negotiate a deal, or we may have to fight. I do hope the Starfleet sends some ships for backup, if the fighting option is all that's left. The two of us can't hold off a Romulan fleet, and if the Klingons become involved, well, we will need all the help we can get about that. Wouldn't the Klingons be more of a benefit in this case? Phelps asked. For all, they could keep the Romulans busy. In this case, Commander, the Klingons would most likely split their forces for an attack, Savage commented. They will send some ships to engage the Romulans, some to beam down to the planet and investigate, and some to attack us, Shaki added in his tactical assessment. They would most likely send more ships after us than after the Romulans, now that the Klingons know that Captain Kirk is on the Enterprise. It, like the Ravager, has a good-sized bounty placed on it. There's not a single Klingon out there who wouldn't give his beard for a shot at either one of us. Then how do you suggest we commence? Savage turned to Kirk. Since we are bound to run into at least one Klingon ship on the way, now that they know you and I are in the area, I believe the best tactic would be for the Ravager to ride shotgun for you. Ride shotgun? Spock quizzed. The Enterprise would go to Ganeth, while we follow cloaked. If there's any trouble, we uncloak and take care of the problem. Savage knew that sounded like a boast, and the look on Kirk's face indicated that he thought so as well, but it couldn't be helped. Savage explained his statement. Your ship has more defensive and offensive power, Captain Kirk, but we can elude attacks better than your ship due to our higher maneuverability and cloaking device. If someone comes after you, we can get them to follow us, leaving you with some clear shots. Kirk caught on. So we can get them in a crossfire. Shaki nodded. Correct, Captain. We shall do the same. With our sensors, we will know when a ship is on intercept course before you will. Just how are your sensors rated, Captain? As an IC operative, we have equipment that is not available to ships of the line, Captain Spock. With the equipment we have, plus the modifications of our own, we have nearly 10 times the range as your sensors, and our resolution for details are such that we could just about tell you how many ants are invading a picnic from orbit. If you like, I can have my sensor specialist come over and see what he can do for your system. I would be very interested in such. Not a problem, Mr. Spock. He looked at Kirk. How long until your ship is fully repaired? At last report, about an hour. Good. I'll have my man beamed over. He breathed in deeply and looked at Kirk. One more thing, Captain. Out here, you have to play for keeps. You saw how we dealt with the Klingon ships. In a triangle, there is no such word as overkill. Many times a damaged ship will still be able to inflict damage, even enough to destroy another. It may go against what Starfleet teaches, but it's often very necessary to be a little savage. Don't leave an enemy ship with enough power to launch a counterattack, and if possible, don't give the enemy a chance to fire first. As long as I'm around, we won't have to worry too much about the Romulans. It's the Klingons that we'll have to deal with. Kirk nodded to Savage. Understood. He knew how to deal with Klingons. Anything else we should discuss? How well does Kenton know you? Phelps asked. I'm sure he's heard of me, Savage answered with a slight smile. Most people around here have. What he may know about me depends upon who he's talked to. I can be anything from the most bloodthirsty pirate to a savior of the spaceways. He looked at Kirk and smiled. You know how gossip gets around. Kirk smiled back but said nothing as Savage continued. If there's nothing else, Captain, I need to return to my ship. Kirk looked around, seeing that there were no further questions. Nothing else, Captain. I'll get those torpedoes sent over to you. And thanks for the save. Savage smiled slyly with a glint in his eye. Oh, don't thank me yet, Captain. You haven't seen the total bill. Kirk smiled as the group walked out on their respective ways. McCoy finally got Kirk alone in the turbolift. Just how much do you think we can trust him, Jim, if we meet up with the Romulans? Kirk thought a moment. I don't know, Bones. Despite his outward appearance, I don't think Savage wants to get into a firefight, especially with the Romulans. But I do get the impression that when things get against the wall, he won't let us down. At least, Kirk hopes so.